The History of Latin by the Latin 2 class.
The Great Vowel Shift occurred around 1400 to 1700. Sounds became higher and they moved further forward in the mouth. It was quite quick, yet it only happened in English. This might be because Latin words required different pronunciation and very English accents were a fad that stuck with people. Some words changed quite a bit. Some did not. The English Renaissance brought back the classic ancient Greek and Roman culture. Latin and Greek were considered the languages of scholars, and a large number of Latin-ish words were added to the English language. You can see that the largest amount of Latin words were added to the English language during the Renaissance. Some Latin words survived in English, some, however, did not. Silent letters were also added during the English Renaissance, and English was being recognized as a legit language. With the invention of the printing press, information was able to be spread easier, and new ideas emerged and were written down. Information was allowed to spread quickly, accurately, and cheaply. With the invention of the printing press, information was able to be spread easier as new ideas emerged and were written down. Information was allowed to spread quickly, accurately, and cheaply. The printing press allowed for books to become cheaper and more available, so more people were able to get an education. The printing press also made it hard for the church to suppress these ideas. At the time, there were 5 major dialects of English in Britain, but the printing press brought standardization to England. Also, the printing press helped grammar develop. In the 1st century AD in Britain, Christianity demanded that its followers only worship the Christian God. This had to be kept a secret because it was threatening to the Romans if you did not worship the state gods. Constantine made it so that Christianity was legal throughout the Roman Empire, and eventually Christianity appealed to Constantine, so he converted, as well as converting a large part of the Eastern Empire. Christianity survived all of the later invasions of Britain, and somehow, despite efforts by other groups to eradicate it. Augustine was an influential figure who spread Christianity to Britain in 597 AD. He went from Rome to Kent and created an alliance between Christianity and the kingships in Britain. This made it so the kings in Britain were Christian, which made the Anglo-Saxons eventually adopt Christianity. However, the Vikings threatened Christianity. Later, a missionary named Alfred made Christianity so that the illiterate farm people could practice it as well. William the Conqueror spread Christianity by building a lot of churches. Christianity during the medieval period was also very influential. The missionaries that came to Britain spread Latin words. The expansion of English is largely due to Latin as well. Catholic monks mainly wrote in Latin, but when they did write in English, they would use Latin words for words that didn't have an English translation. This is how a lot of Christian or Latin words came into English. Christianity also spread to Europe through the Bible. The Bibles were handwritten by monks in Latin, but when the monks did write in English, they would again put Latin words in for words that did not have an English translation.
On the Proto-European language tree, Latin falls under the Italic branch and is the origin of a group known as the Romance languages: French, Romanian, Spanish, Catalan, Portuguese, and Italian. One of the most important questions to consider is how Latin became such a widespread and important language and gave birth to the others. In medieval times, Latin was brought to England but was insignificant in the larger picture. Gradually, the Christian Church made it more widespread, but it was still only limited among the upper class. French became very widely used during this time. Since French is sort of a daughter language of Latin, it includes many Latin elements. Therefore, the people learning French were in fact both absorbing French and Latin at the same time. In England, French-speaking individuals were always of the upper class and constantly held positions of power. This is why French and Latin are associated with sophistication today. Some of the lower class in England started learning the languages to sound well educated and sometimes simply to communicate with their masters. Today, many people associate Latin classes with SATs and English vocabulary. But how did this happen? It turns out that all those Latin roots didn't integrate into English directly. In fact, Latin indirectly influenced English through French. This is how it happened. So first, Julius Caesar, dictator of Rome, conquered the region of Gaul, France. Although Latin wasn't imposed here, he made Latin essential for daily life. For example, to enjoy the benefits of Roman citizenship, which was in turn essential for climbing the social ladder, people had to adopt the lifestyle, religion, and language of Rome. Latin in Gaul, over time, developed into a form called Vulgar Latin. Vulgar Latin was Latin of commoners rather than aristocrats. Vulgar Latin diverged from Classical Latin and eventually outlasted it. Vulgar Latin itself splintered into different variations in different provinces. For example, because Gaul experienced contact with Germany, its form of Vulgar Latin changed more than usual. Vulgar Latin in northern Gaul eventually became the French language. In the year 1066, the Normans brought French to England in an invasion. French essentially borrowed words from Latin. It became a prominent language among nobles. Latin influences English today because through early Gaulish, Latin brought words to France and then to England. Some of these words include flora and fauna. In addition, influence can be seen through word triplets. Word triplets are distinct words derived from the same source but at different times and by different paths. For example, a Latin, Norman French, and French triplet would be regal, royal, and real. An Old French, French, and Latin triplet could be kingly, royal, and real.
When the British started to discover newer and stranger species, they needed a more universal language to name all of them. They immediately went to Latin, the language of education at the time. All of the known organisms have a kingdom, a phylum, a class, an order, a family, a genus, and a species that is named with a Latin or Greek word. They usually consist of a Latin noun or adjective. They make up a lot of the Greek and Latin words in our language today. In the English Renaissance, which took place mainly in the 15th century, Latin became the sign of intelligence and scholarship. Writers such as William Shakespeare were very famous and highly revered. These writers wanted to sound smart, and to do so they made new words. These words consisted mainly of Latin roots combined with prefixes and suffixes. A very famous inkhorn is Shakespeare himself, who made a lot of words we still use today, such as excitement, which comes from Latin excitare, meaning to call out, and the suffix ment, which comes from Latin mentum, which was a suffix that represented the product of an action. However, Shakespeare was not the only one who did this. Many writers did this, and a lot of the words stuck. Most of the words that come from this time period, however, were instead just imported and mostly whole from Latin. These words were brought from Latin, the language of education, either because the English synonyms had negative connotations, or because there were no pre-existing words that fit the required definition. Many of the words we use today in papers that make us sound smart were invented during this time period, because those words were generally invented for the express purpose of sounding educated. This time period brought many great words from Latin into the English language.
When Latin first became a part of the English language, it came through religion, as the Anglo-Saxons in Britain converted to Christianity. Christianity had been a part of Rome, and the official language of Christianity was Latin. Since Latin was the language of Christianity and the people started to convert to Christianity, it began to be spoken by the Anglo-Saxons. Because religion was, at that point, still part of academics and politics, speaking Latin became a sign of education. So along with many different academic words from Latin, there are also religious words that have carried on. There are words such as tenent, omen, and augur. Some of these words, like tenant, can be used in a religious context, but also with a broader meaning, such as tenant is something held to a belief system, and originally in Latin means he hold. However, religious words can also retain their religious connotations, such as omen, which is still associated with prophecy and religion, or the word creator, which can still mean a religious creator. Another type of word that was incorporated into English from Latin were judicial words. These words and phrases consist of things like habeas corpus, modus operandi, de jure, and amicus curiae. These words meant things like you may have the body, method of operation, according to the law, and friend of the court. These types of words may have come into English for multiple reasons, such as Rome coming into Britain and conquering them. The Romans would have tried to Latinize the system, and many Latin phrases were incorporated. The Romans would come in and Romanize Britain over time. They would make army camps permanent settlements, and slowly people would begin to settle around them. Then, in the time, the settlements became towns and cities, and those cities copied the ways of the life of the Romans. Therefore, Latin phrases in the English legal system, which was based off of the legal system of the Romans, led to such words as habeas corpus being incorporated into the English legal system.